What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. You know, I'm beginning to think that 2024 it may be bigger than Biden. I've just been thinking that look, Biden is such a dumpster fire as a president that he's just gonna be one of these presidents that's one of these candidates that's just going to lose a lot of traditional Democratic support that might be regained by 2028. But now I'm beginning to think, and don't get me wrong, I think it is being expedited by Biden's horribleness as a president, or the process is being expedited. But I think that 2024 might be seen in history as a realignment election. Okay? And by realignment, I mean that some of the long standing traditional groups that have been supporting the Democratic Party are fracturing, or maybe switching sides, or there's a process that these things are beginning to change. Look, we've had various realignment elections in history. I think the first one is you could call the 1800 election. And then I think the next realignment was 1828. The next one I would say was in 1860. The next realignment election, 1896. Then I would say 1932, 1968, although some would argue 1980, and then 1992. 1992 is probably the last realignment election. Now, I'm a little bit fuzzy with my history with some of these things, but I think one of the reasons why you can say 1800 was the first realignment election is because that was the first election where we really saw the development of what would become the two-party system. When Washington was president, Washington was such a commanding figure that he had such support that we really didn't have a two-party system. It started crumbling a bit under the second president, John Adams, but by 1800 we developed a two-party system. And the two major parties at the time became the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, which was being started and formed by Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Republican Party would eventually loosely become the Democratic Party, which is the next realignment election in 1828. Now, at that time, Andrew Jackson was the standard bearer. Now, they were called the Democratic Republican Party still, but by the next election, 1832, they'd be called the Democratic Party as we know it today. By that point, the Federalist Party had ceased to exist, and by that point, John Quincy Adams, who himself had ran as a Democratic Republican in 1824, because the Federalist Party had dissipated by 1820. By 1828, he was calling himself a National Republican. Not the same Republican Party that we think of today, though. Now, 1860 was seen as the next realignment election because, although erroneously sometimes Abraham Lincoln is called the first Republican candidate for president, he was not. The first one was John C. Fremont, 1856, who lost to James Buchanan. But 1860 is seen as a realignment election because of the fact that we saw the growth and the realignment of many states of the North consistently and solidly for the Republican Party, and the South for the Democratic Party. As a matter of fact, the Democratic Party was so split at that point between the standard bearer, Stephen A. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge for the I guess we call the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for what was a third party, Constitutional Union. The Democratic Party was split in three ways, and that allowed Abraham Lincoln to be elected in a landslide. Although evidence also shows that the country was so split because of slavery that even if Lincoln was off the ballot in all of the southern states, which would allow the Democratic candidate to get 60% of the vote nationally, Lincoln still would have won the Electoral College. The next realignment election was 1896. Now, why was that a realignment election? Because of the fact that for the first time, the industrial states, although there were other issues in that election, in 1896, for the first time, there was a tipping point in this country where the industrial state or the industrial states outpolled the rural states in this country. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate, was seen as the candidate of the people, the populist candidate. Whereas William McKinley, more than any other candidate before him and perhaps since, was seen, maybe with the possible exception of Calvin Coolidge, was seen as the candidate for big business, the candidate of the industrialists. And, while we did have other issues going on in that election, ultimately McKinley was elected president. 1932 was seen as a realignment election because of the FDR victory. That was the election, when we was in the midst of the Great Depression. FDR won in a big landslide against Herbert Hoover. But that was seen as a realignment election because of the FDR coalition, which would dominate politics for much of the 20th century. The FDR coalition consists of farmers, labor unions, the South, blue-collar workers, and African Americans. Because before that, African Americans were voting majority Republican. Now, on a state and local level, for a couple of more decades, black people would still at times vote Republican. They didn't have the monopoly then overall that they have starting in the 60s, but that was the first time on a national level that blacks voted Democratic. That would continue, although it would become more solidified throughout the 50s and 60s. Although Eisenhower and Nixon in 1960 did get a large percentage of the black vote, but not a majority. 1968 was seen as a realignment election for various reasons. This was the time when the Republican Party started making overtures toward the Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats, at that point, felt a little bit, they felt a lot from a national level. They felt like the Democratic Party was abandoning them. Lyndon Johnson, the liberal wing of the party, realized that they didn't necessarily need the South to win elections anymore. So you saw the liberal wing of the party become more and more dominant. That's why, in 1964, Goldwater, who famously or infamously voted against the Civil Rights Bill, he did so well in the South because they perceived him as one of them, a racist. So you started seeing Southerners vote Democratic. You started seeing Southerners vote Republican. And also, for the Democrats, you started seeing them court African Americans more, even more so. You started seeing them court Latinos, young people. You start seeing the beginnings of what we see today in the Democratic Party, and the FDR coalition of farmers, laborers, and all that was fracturing. You know what I'm saying? The farmers, blue collar workers, they were starting to drift because they thought that the Democratic Party no longer represented the white working class voter and was looking out for the others. So many of them began to drift either third party, or a good percentage of them were starting to vote Republican. So we started seeing this realignment of both parties. Which brings you to 1992. Clinton is elected. So what happened in 1992 was you started seeing a consolidation of what was happening on a national level begin to happen on a state and local level with the Republican Party. Whereas many Republicans were winning national elections, getting white male votes in the South. White males are still voting Democratic on the state and local level. The Dixiecrat candidates, the John Stennis's, and all those conservative white Democrats. But they were beginning to die out or retire, and they were being replaced by Republicans who were conservative. So the Republican Party started becoming even more conservative. But what happened was many of the more progressive, moderate Republicans weren't feeling that shit. So you started seeing longtime Yankee Republican states like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, although the process started a little bit earlier in Rhode Island. You started seeing many of these formerly Republican states vote Democratic. You know what I'm saying? You started seeing states that were competitive at one point, like California and New York, start becoming increasingly more Democratic. Sound familiar? So, I'm thinking that this might be a realignment election of another sort. What we're going to start seeing is a fracturing of black people from the Democratic Party. As I've stated before, I do not believe that on a level consistent with our history, we are not liberals. I'm not saying we're conservatives. We're not. But we're not liberals. We've always been a more conservative people when it comes to certain viewpoints. They're trying to push that on us. It started with the Obama years. That's why many black people have soured on Barack Obama over the years. We're starting to find out that the Democratic Party's never had, at least in the last, I say 30 years since the Clinton era, they've been snowing us. They've been often, with Republicans, having a squabble about race shit, while both sides are fucking us all over. Republicans are fucking over their constituency, but distracting them with, hey, it's these people over here. The Democrats playing the same game. And they fucking over both sides. Like George Carlin said, it's a big club, and we're not in it. None of us. Same thing with Latinos. Young voters who generally vote more liberal and progressively get more conservative as they get older. You see with young voters, they're not voting Democratic. They're either not voting third party, or some of them identify with Trump for whatever reason. But I predict, I'm starting to think now, because here we are in January. Okay, we're in January, so now we're 10 months away, more or less, from the election. And Biden's numbers are not getting any better. I'm starting to think that Joe Biden is going to lose in an electoral landslide. I don't know about the popular vote, but I think he's going to lose an electoral landslide. And I don't see how it's going to be avoided. Because I said before, even when he was elected in 2020, many people were just voting against Trump because they were angry. They didn't really vote for Biden because they liked him. They were just voting against Trump. But now, people are angry at Joe Biden. So he's never really had that core constituency that was hardcore for him. I would say, maybe some special interest groups, they're for him strongly. A lot of black women, they're going to come out strongly for him. I wouldn't be surprised to come out strongly for him in some high numbers. There are going to be some African American men that come out and vote for him. But there's also going to be, I think, potentially 15 to 25% of black voters who are not going to vote for him. And that's a staggeringly high number for a Democratic candidate. I wouldn't be surprised if, 30 to 40% of Latinos don't vote for Joe Biden or don't show up at all. I wouldn't be surprised if 40% of young people either don't vote or don't vote for Joe Biden. They don't sound like a lot, but that is. It's a lot. So anyway, these polls, they continue to show that he's not doing well with traditional traditional Democratic groups. Only 63% support in the black community. That's been a consistent number. 6 out of 10, 6 out of 10, 6 out of 10. In 2020, he was approaching 90%. Latinos, I think he's only getting 40% support with Latinos. Last time he was getting 2/3, close to 70%. Young people, he's not doing very well. Matter of fact, I think Trump's getting a majority of young voters. So, it is what it is. Tell me what you guys think.